Okay, ooh, nice. Welcome, very nice to see you. Welcome to the School of Visual Arts and to the MA Department of Design Research, Writing and Criticism. I'm Alice, and thank you very much, thank you. I know it's because, you know, you've got to keep doing that forever now. You can't stop, the trouble. So here's our lovely lecture series this fall. We had a busy week, actually, because we had one yesterday as well, at lunchtime, and we're definitely on the curatorial tip at the moment, because we had John Swader, who's a designer, kind of coming into curation from that perspective. We have our guest tonight, of course, who we'll hear more about in a minute. And then, in a way, the owners of Kiosk are really engaging with curation in their store in a kind of interesting way. And then we finish up with the newly appointed curator of architecture and design at the Met. So I hope you're into curation, basically. And of course, you're welcome to join all of them. They're always open to the public, just to mention that. Before we launch into tonight's event, I just want to mention a couple of things about the program for any of you who are new here. We recently changed to a one-year MA, and the best way to find out about the program is definitely to stay afterwards, have drinks with us, chat with the students. That's the most fun way to do it. You can also visit our website at designresearch.sva.edu. Lots of information there. And then we also have videos of all the previous lectures on our Vimeo site. And these fun little promotional videos that we did to check out. And I also want to draw your attention to a video we made of the open house that we held last week, if people are interested in checking that out. And in case you don't have time to watch it, I'm going to give you some highlights. So we had faculty, current students, and alums giving their kind of experiences of engaging with design research, whether that's in the classroom as instructors or putting it into practice in the workplace. And some highlights for me, I think, were Daniela Fabricus, who teaches cultural theory, was about her own research, which dealt with Frei Otto and Eberhard Haug, and their pneumatic experiments with inflated animal intestines from 1973, which I thought looked rather fabulous. And then there was Matthew Worsnick, who teaches design history here on the program, and I gave him license to fetishize the primary source in as much detail as he wanted to, and he did. And here is, this is part of his research into architecture's role in, the kind of contested borders that turned up in the former Yugoslavia. Very interesting research territory. And then there was Anne Quito's very elegant riposte to the notion of the armchair critic, right? The idea that we need to get out on the streets doing the research in person. And so she gave an account of her recent visit to CERN, which is the home of the largest Hadron Collider. And she told us about some of the ways that she had put some of the tools of research into action. I thought it was interesting that she found out that parts of the collider were actually manufactured in different parts of the world and were assembled like a ship in a bottle here. There was no claimed architect or designer. It was done from an engineering point of view. She was also looking at, she called this the semiotic wonderland of warning signs, which I thought was good. She said there were so many signs, posters, bells, lights, reminders, sometimes right next to each other, like a pyromaniac's mood board, which, it's definitely a fun area for investigation. Brittany, a current student took us to the dump, and this is actually the waste recycling facility out in Sunset Park that the students visited a few weeks ago. And Brittany was talking about just a sort of range of field trips that we do and the way they kind of relate to what we're reading and thinking about at any one time. By contrast, we also went to the place where they make some of that waste, the Shapeways 3D printing facility in Long Island City, which was illuminating. And finally, here's a taster of Molly's research, which is the material culture of the Mars 2.0 space race, which I think gives a good example of the kind of, the far reaches of the manifestations of design that we like to deal with. But tonight we're here for a lecture, and basically it's a very straight-up lecture format, followed by some questions, and then the MA students get priority asking questions in the Q&A. So that's how it goes. And I'm just completely delighted to be introducing Glenn Adamson this evening, who last week celebrated his 1-year anniversary, or 2 weeks ago, his 1-year anniversary as a director of Museum of Arts and Design. I met Glenn, though, when he was Director of Graduate Studies and then Research at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. I was a PhD candidate, admitted to the very department that Glenn had kind of expanded and reshaped. And in my encounters with Glenn, I was always impressed by the supreme breadth of his knowledge about all aspects of design. As part of his role in the research department, he had to oversee a big variety of exhibitions, including those he co-curated, such as the 2011 survey of Postmodernism that I'm sure you were aware of, and the forthcoming exhibition, which sounds really exciting, the title of which I adore, The Future, A History. Which is great. And that's going to kind of inaugurate the V&A's new temporary exhibition galleries in 2017. But where he goes deep, and I mean scholarly deep, is with the topic of craft. As an advocate for the legitimacy and contemporary relevance of craft, I think, Glenn has had a widespread influence on makers as well as craft historians and theorists. He's published a bunch of books on the topic, which include The Invention of Craft, The Craft Reader, Thinking Through Craft, and is the founding co-editor of the Journal of Modern Craft, which I believe was the first peer-reviewed academic journal devoted to craft, which is a fantastic achievement. So we're really lucky, I think, to have Glenn here tonight, a year into his adventure at MAD, at a moment when he might be doing a bit of stock-taking on the events of the past year. He's generously agreed to share his reflections on this kind of transition from scholar and researcher to cultural administrator, as well as probably his move back to the US. How long were you in the UK for? Yeah, so some form of culture shock, I'm sure, involved in that. In the course of the talk, I'm sure Glenn will be discussing his thoughts on the remit and purpose of a museum dedicated to the collection, display, and interpretation of the materials, processes, and sometimes results of what he terms skilled making. We are especially lucky that Glenn is a particularly skilled maker himself when it comes to the practice of writing. And I believe he'll also be sharing with us some of the ways in which writing still figures in what he does today. So, let's hear it from Glenn. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Alice. It seems like a long time since we first met over in London, and it's wonderful to be here with all of you tonight. I'm just going to give you a few remarks about the museum, and that will be a kind of lecture format, but then I want to open up the conversation to question and answer, because I think that might be a bit more interesting. So I'm going to go quite quickly through some slides. But just in a preparatory way, I'll first say that Alice is absolutely right. I've made this transition from being a scholar and critic to being a cultural administrator, which is quite a nice, decorous way of describing what I do. What does that involve? Well, it involves a lot of management, it involves a lot of fundraising, it involves a lot of advocacy and public spokespersonship, and it in fact doesn't give me much time for writing, at least not in any official capacity. I find that most of my writing is now confined to very quick answers to journalists, forwards to exhibition catalogs, and the occasional sneaky project that I write on a Saturday night. And so it is a real shift for me, both in terms of my professional activities and also in terms of my shift from, as Alice said, from London to New York City. And I guess I would say, and you probably all are very aware of this, that the major difference in respect to museums between here and the United Kingdom is that in Europe generally there's a huge amount of public funding for museums, whereas here museums do tend to be privately funded apart from the Smithsonian. And so that creates a wholly different climate for cultural activity, one which is much more engaged with the interests of private sponsorship, and here I'm talking about both individuals and corporations, and is much less public-minded by its nature. And so one starting proposition that I would have for you is that the challenge for any museum administrator in America is to make sure that you are thinking as a public-minded individual, because you don't have the external pressure forcing you to do that as you do in London. So in London, to put it bluntly, if you don't think with the interests of the public in mind first and foremost, you are in fact financially punished for it. Whereas in this country, it's in fact the museum staff that needs to make sure that the interests of the public are always first and foremost. And that has guided a lot of what I've tried to do in this first year. And so you might say that my work at the museum in many respects is trying to act critically or apply the lessons that I gained as a scholar, academic, researcher to the project of running a museum. So to keep the same principles intact and apply them here in New York City. So how am I doing that? Well, now I'm going to get quite specific for you. First of all, it's important to know something about the history of this museum. How many of you have been to the Museum of Arts and Design in its new site? Great. Okay, almost everybody. So that's it, of course, on the right-hand side, Columbus Circle, the only traffic circle in New York City, by the way, or in Manhattan, I should say. And then on the left is the original building that the museum had when it was founded. Back then, it was called the Museum of Contemporary Crafts. It was founded in 1956. This is the north side of 53rd Street, right next to the Museum of Modern Art. And that's important. As you can tell, modernist building. It was a converted townhouse. And the museum in those days was very, very strongly aligned with MoMA. Eventually, this building was destroyed to make way for Museum Tower. So you could say that's an interesting foreshadowing of what's recently happened with the Folk Art Museum. And it moved across the street to the south side of 53rd Street. You may remember it as the American Craft Museum in that guise, had a big white staircase. And it stayed there until 6 years ago when we moved to our present location with this redesigning of the site by Brad Klopfel. And if you Google the Museum of Arts and Design, you can still find lots of opinions about the architectural renovation of this site. The original building, the Huntington Hartford building, was designed by Edward Durrell Stone, no insignificant modernist architect in his own right. Also, by the way, designer of one version of the MoMA facade, which has also been destroyed to make way for the present Taniguchi building. As I say, we've been there for 6 years now and are very happy with what Brad did in putting us in this new home. Now, I wanted to start with this comparison partly because one of the first things that I've done, if you might say critically, as a director, is to try to put the museum's history back in the center, because I feel that with these three changes of location and name, one of the things that's got lost is the sense of a continuous founding mission for the institution, and that founding mission comes to us from this person, whose name is Mrs. Eileen Osborne Vanderbilt Webb, Mrs. Webb, we call her. Has anybody heard of her? One person, great. So nobody has heard of her. Why? Well, possibly because she's a woman, for starters. Certainly because she was unlucky enough to be the most important philanthropist, patron, visionary advocate in the arena of craft, as opposed to some other field of endeavor. So she was active from the 1930s, the era of the Depression, forward, until her death in 1979, as the most important advocate for craft in the world. So she founded not only the museum in 1956, but also the American Craft Council in 1940, a school called the School of American Crafts, which is in Rochester now at the university there. She founded the World Crafts Council 50 years ago at Columbia University in 1964, which went strong throughout the rest of her life. The first international craft advocacy organization, really important as an antecedent for today's NGOs. And I could go on and on. She founded a store, she founded a magazine. She was absolutely amazing in every respect, except she was not particularly a good potter, although she did try. But it shows you that she cared, and she was sort of putting her hands where her mouth was, and also where her money was. She was born into the Osborne family, one of New York's so-called great families, and married into two others, the Vanderbilt and Webb families. So she had the wherewithal to sustain this vision. And she was not only the leader and advocate and spokesperson for the craft movement from about 1939 to her death in 1979, so it's 40 years, but also its primary financial sponsor. So you could well say that the fact that she's been forgotten is nothing less than criminal. But what happens is, if you don't have writers and you don't have critics and historians, these things get forgotten. It's not out of ill will. And literally when I arrived, even my trustees, about 30-some trustees at the museum, and only a very small handful of them had even heard of her, despite the fact that they were the trustees of the museum that she had founded, not even 60 years ago. Extraordinary, no? It's like if the trustees of the V&A hadn't heard of Henry Cole, or an American hadn't heard of George Washington. As I say, gender might have something to do with this. But at any rate, what I have wanted to do is reinstill her presence in the museum. So one thing that we've done, and I'm sorry I don't have images of this, is to do an exhibition about her, which is on view now at the museum through February 8th. So come along and see that. It tells the whole history of the institution and her impact. But also what I've tried to do is recover her ideas, maybe more importantly, than her presence and her example as an individual. And so what were her ideas? Well, they were really around the idea of making and craftsmanship and skill as a positive force for contemporary life. And again, she was very strongly aligned with MoMA, Museum of Modern Art, in those days. And so her vision was extremely progressive in the sense that she thought that skilled makers, she would have called them probably designer craftsmen, were a powerful force for good, simply for good ethical progress in life. And that, to some degree, this group of makers stood against the dehumanizing effects of industry. And that's a subtle question which we don't have a lot of time to go into. She was actually very sympathetic to the idea that machines might have an important role to play in connection to the hand. Obviously, the machine aesthetic was in full swing at MoMA in those days. But what she was really interested in was a kind of individualism and an investment in the individual, and also the individual's investment in themselves as somebody with the capacity and literally the physical skills, the know-how to change the world for the better. And I would argue that this is still a relevant mission today. And moreover, that given the prevalence of on-screen experience, and I did a quick head count before Alice started talking, and about half of you were on your phones, right? Which is probably a bit lower than average for the American population. Nothing wrong with that, but you can ask yourself how many of you actually know how to make something skillfully and masterfully with your hands, not counting Twitter. And the answer is one at least, but the answer is a few of you, and it's important to you probably if you know how to do it, and most people don't know how to do it, and this was true, of course, in Mrs. Webb's time as well. And what we are about as a museum, and always have been about, is respect for makers, respect for these individuals, and also an investment in the process by which things are made, as well as in the finished object. Now, it so happens that this mission is of outstanding contemporary relevance, so we have a lot of potential allies out there, which is very useful for me as a director. As I said, I have to do a lot of fundraising and a lot of work with press, marketing, and so on. And so this whole array of discourse with which I'm sure you're very familiar, the maker movement, whether it's Wired magazine or wallpaper, what have you, or the kind of tech aspect of this. In fact, you just mentioned Shapeways, which had a residency in our museum a year ago as part of an exhibition we did on digital fabrication techniques. This whole realm of activity, which is expressly, even politically, about empowerment through technology and the instilling of individuals with skills and capacity that they might otherwise have lacked, has totally reshaped the conversation around questions of craft. And without getting too much into the nomenclature debates, I would suggest that probably, had this happened earlier, the museum would not have changed its name from the American Craft Museum to the Museum of Arts and Design. You know, even 10 years ago, the word craft was seen as a kind of albatross hanging around the institution's neck. Now, craft is a word that gets people's attention. Many corporations are using it in their own branding, and it's certainly a way for us to reach a totally new population, many of whom, by the way, live in Brooklyn rather than on the Upper West Side. But there's a whole new generation that's opened up to the message that the museum has been occupying for a long time. And these are just some stats on the maker movement, which I think are interesting. And you always have to be suspicious of these numbers, but they are interesting. The idea that 57% of adults in America are makers of some kind, and that number is rising, rising, rising. You have to ask the question, what does that mean? What kind of maker? But certainly, it's a big bandwagon, and a lot of people are on it. And it's also reflected in the art world. So here, for example, is the top floor of the Whitney Biennial, curated by Michelle Grabner, who, by the way, has a nice show up at James Cohan Gallery. And I'm going to be speaking there Saturday after this one coming up, if you're interested, with Michelle. And as you can see from these images, she was very, 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 very interested in traditionally associated craft materials like ceramics, so the work of Sterling Ruby in the upper left, Shio Kusaka on the lower left, John Mason, one of the great figures of the California ceramic movement of the 50s and 60s on the lower right, also Sheila Hicks, the great fiber artist whose work you can see descending from the ceiling there. So art world embrace of the media formerly known as craft media. Also in the design world, you have lots and lots of examples. This pulled at random. The Eindhoven-based design firm Forma Fantasma, Italian-born but based in the Netherlands. And you can see the kind of earnestness and directness of fabrication technique that designers like Forma Fantasma are using today. So all to say, this opens up a huge arena, a huge terrain for us, a lot of opportunity, you might say. And the question is, how do we exploit that? So I've just pulled this quote out of a survey that was done on museums and other cultural institutions by a kind of research institute recently. And they've said, we are in the midst of a seismic shift in cultural production, moving from sit back and be told culture to a making and doing culture. And I'm sure this is something you've talked a lot about here on the DCRIT program, Design Research Program, the idea that more and more commentary, discourse, discussion, exchange of ideas is not a passive affair where you have a centralized authority saying, we say it is like this, and then an audience accepting that. Instead, you have a constant set of feedback loops. It's a kind of cybernetic model of communication that is becoming the norm, particularly for people, obviously, in the so-called first world who have the access to this. And the question is, what can you do in a museum to take advantage of this situation and in fact, even be relevant within a situation like this? And for me, the answer is create a museum that is not so much about teaching people facts or exposing them to beautiful works of art, although of course we do that, but instead a museum that is about inspiring people to actually go and make things. So for me, the simple, clear mission of the museum is to respect makers and hold them up for maybe even admiration, but certainly for attention. But above that, and beyond that, and more importantly, every person that comes to the museum ideally should be inspired to go and try making something. So it's a totally different way of thinking what a museum would be trying to do, in a sense. If you go to the Metropolitan Museum, you may leave thinking, man, I really wish I could paint like Rembrandt. But that's not the point of the museum. They might support that kind of thing, have people painting the galleries, etc. But what I want to do with MAD is create the sense in every visitor, as many people as possible, that they can independently and as individuals help reshape the world around them in a way that they can control and that they would like to train themselves or learn how to make things according to their own imagination and creativity. So it's like a mission about empowerment rather than edification. Fortunately for me, the museum does a lot of this sort of thing already. So before I arrived, they already had quite a few platforms and mechanisms in place for achieving this kind of effect. The most important probably is the open studios at the museum. So this is a fellow called Chris Pelletieri, and he is carving stone in our open studios. You can see he has a pretty good view. That's Christopher Columbus out the window. You can see there, so he's looking out on the park and Broadway and Central Park West. And he's one example of the makers, artists, designers that we've had come into the 6th floor of the museum. And in fact, every minute of every day that we're open, we have a maker at work ready to meet the public and talk to them about what they're doing on the 6th floor. And at the front desk, visitors are in fact directed to go to the 6th floor first, meet a maker, and then go down into the galleries. So they already have in their mind some kind of template or they're prepared to experience objects as the evidence or residue of making. So again, it's this idea of turning the prioritization of the museum around to emphasize process and backstory rather than finished results. And of course, I should say we're very interested in reflecting on new technologies, not just arcane and traditional ones. So from stone carving to 3D printing in the education activities on the 6th floor in the open studios. Also, perhaps less obviously, but to me very importantly, the store at MAD is a really important engine and platform for doing this. And this may sound a little bit like a craven museum director's justification for being involved in profit making, but I really do think that our store, which by the way is the 13th most successful museum store in the country, not bad considering it's the size of a postage stamp, this store is actually one of the most important things that we do for the population of makers nationwide, because we're actually giving people an opportunity to show their work in the middle of Manhattan and derive benefit from it. And there's a whole issue here about how much museums should be operating in the direct interest, and I mean the entrepreneurial interest of makers, and how much they should be standing apart from that and simply being a neutral platform in which to show that work. I tend to be very much of the mind that the more a museum can economically advantage the people that we serve, the makers, the more we are doing our job. And so I feel like the store is just as important a part of what we do as what we do in the galleries or in our education program, partly because of its directness. So what are we doing coming up to support this mission? Just a couple of examples. One is this exhibition about mannequin design and manufacture. And this is the work of a fellow called Ralph Pucci. And his workshop is actually over in the Flatiron District. It's here in Manhattan, and it's the entire floor of a historic building. So he does absolutely all of this work, these mannequins, which are designed by people like Philippe Stark and Isabella and Ruben Toledo and Kenny Scharf. This is going back into the 80s. And then used to sell clothing in Saks Fifth Avenue and Nordstrom's and Neiman Marcus and so on. He makes all of these mannequins in Manhattan. It's quite surprising. And one of the things I'm always thinking about is the fact that when you walk around the city, there's making going on all around you, and you're probably completely unaware of it. Like Tiffany still makes its work upstairs, a lot of its work. And similarly, Ralph Pucci's mannequin factory is right there. You just don't know that it's there necessarily. But the way that we're going to exhibit this fascinating subject, which is almost like a sculpture show by other means, you could say, but also, of course, intersects with fashion and retail history, is to show a retrospective of the mannequins and then also to recreate his shop in the gallery so that you'll have this rather surreal experience of seeing all these mannequins, limbs, torsos hanging there, as it were, ready for the spray booth. And his sculptor, Michael Everett, is going to be on the premises regularly during the exhibition and actually carving the likeness of people, and then they're going to be turned into mannequins. So for example, we could have an Alice Twemlow mannequin at the end of the show. And did you say terrific or horrific? Horrific, maybe a little bit of each, but that's the fascination of mannequins, isn't it? And so the idea here is to take something that people see all the time around them every day. You know, every time you go to a department store, you see a mannequin, and I would imagine that 95% of people have never once given any thought to how they're made, even what they're made from, fiberglass, much less the very involved process by which they're designed and rendered. So that's one example of a project that we have underway. A lot of this is really, if I might be permitted a short personal aside, a lot of this is just recapitulating my own experience of somebody who's interested in objects and trying to bring it into a museum. So even before I became a craft specialist, as it were, I had this very, very strong affinity for objects, but I was also really interested in how they came to be. So this example, this object happens to be the ceramic dish that started my career, you might say. So this was when I was an undergraduate in college. I, at random, took a course on the history of Chinese ceramics because it fit in my schedule. And this dish was handed around during the first session that we had in the back storeroom of the gallery. And unfortunately, I don't have a picture of the back of it, but I turned it over, and you could see the fingerprints of the Chinese artisan, or artisans, who knows, who made this thing back in the Tang Dynasty. And you could put your fingers where that person's fingers had been over 1,000 years ago. And it was mind-blowing, certainly a lot better than looking at a slide of a painting, which is what I had done in art history courses before that time. And I couldn't have explained it this way at the time, but it really filled me with a desire to understand how things happen, how objects, and especially great, compelling aesthetic objects happen. So that's the kind of start of it, but that goes right through what we're trying to do at the museum. So Wendell Castle, great furniture maker, we now have this object on view with a film about him making it in 1964. We have this object, which is by Joris Laarman, and this is, again, just to show you the analog to digital shift that we're involved with. This is made through 3D printing and then assembled, and you can see it sort of tells the story of its own making. In other words, the use of the puzzle motif is meant to signify the mass customization possibilities that are afforded by 3D printing. Or this object, which was the kind of logo type or iconic symbolic object for the show we did this past summer, NYC Makers, again, tells the story of its own becoming, quite literally. The way that it was made is that the designers, whose names are J.K. Keller and Keetra Dean Dixon, who were very involved in material type experimentation, so typography by other means than digital, took the 6 letters BECOME, put them in metal type, put them upside down and backwards on a flat sheet of metal, and then dripped wax over the letters, layer after layer after layer after layer, until they got this kind of geode surface. So then when they lifted the wax off that shell, they had this image. And in fact, the whole point of this is in fact not to have the object, but to have something to take a picture of. It's quite interesting. So it's like making in the service of the image culture that we inhabit. And so that is why we use this as the central image for the show. And I'll just mention parenthetically, because Alice showed the picture earlier, we also had another piece by Wendell Castle, that green blobby thing that was sitting in the packing crate. The reason we showed that was because we wanted to feature the skills of our packing crate manufacturer, our shipping company, Box Art, and they're one of the most proficient and indeed most expensive shipping crate makers in New York City. Often their crates are more expensive than the objects that are shipped in them, which is quite interesting. And it occurred to me that most people who go to a museum or a private gallery have never even seen a high-end shipping crate. Whereas in my mind, as an experienced museum professional, the shipping crates, the mount making, the conservation is at least as impressive as the art that's often on view, so why not be transparent about that and expose that to the public? This is just another example of a maker that was in the show NYC Makers, Jeff Zimmerman working in glass, and again, objects that almost tell the story of their own creation. So in this case, what he's done is to let these glass baubles, which are quite large actually, almost 2 feet high, almost come to the point of collapse, molten glass, and then to save them. I'm not sure exactly how he does this, and then to put them in an annealing oven, cool them very slowly, and then to spray them with metallic oxides and pigments. I should also just say something about the way that we curated the show, and again, this is the kind of critical faculty of a museum being put into place. What I really wanted to do in the case of this exhibition, NYC Makers, as the title suggests, is capture a portrait of the city through its making culture. So rather than curate it from a central position of authority, we crowdsourced it. And in practice, what this meant was that we asked about 350 people, I think including Alice. Is that right, Alice? Did we ask you? I can't remember now. But maybe you didn't answer the email. But we asked about 350 people to suggest makers who could be included in the show. And of course, we got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of names. And then we appointed a panel of 10 people from around the city to judge the nominations. And then they chose the 100 makers that were in the show. And then I had somebody from my education team actually curate the show, because I didn't want a curator of a classical kind. And the result was, I suppose, if you wanted to be uncharitable, you could say that it looked a little bit like the show had been loaded into a shotgun and fired into the museum from a short distance away. But so it was quite wild and chaotic, and it produced a huge discursive effect. Lots and lots of reviews, both positive and negative. the kind of hysteria that seemed to be reserved, critically speaking, for biennials, that only the Whitney Biennial and other things seem to attract. And indeed, this is the first, I should have said, this is the first of a series of exhibitions, so it's our first biennial. But I really loved that. I loved the sense of having created a wave, and also the sense of having created something that was unruly, but also true of New York City. And I feel like, of course it was true, because we were being like a transparent vessel for the opinions of many, many people. So it's true like Wikipedia is true, if you see what I mean. Wikipedia in the aggregate, which is to say not true in any absolute objective final sense, but a kind of approximation, an empirical approximation or empirical study of a certain set of affairs. Just one other show that I will mention that's coming up at the museum in a couple of years is one that I'm particularly excited about and interested in, which is called Many Hands, Artists and Their Fabricators. And this is a show that is going to feature about 16 artists from historical examples like Sol LeWitt, Donald Judd, Alexander Calder, up to contemporary artists like Ellen Natsui, and Janine Antoni, Fred Wilson, Ai Weiwei, and others. And in each case, what we're going to do is show the relationship that the artist has to their fabricator. So this, needless to say, is not Sol LeWitt, and this is not Ellen Natsui. These are the people that actually make the work for the artist. And we are doing the first exhibition ever on this topic, which when you think about it is quite extraordinary, because one of the things that hits you in the face when you walk through Chelsea and you go through the galleries is that artists don't make their work anymore, by and large. Some do, but they're almost becoming the minority, and certainly they're not advancing the domain of art as aggressively and successfully as people like Ellen Natsui or Jeff Koons or Anish Kapoor, or pick your example, Richard Serra. So the whole idea that an artist makes their own work as an individual and has total control over it through their own skills and proficient technique seems to have been abandoned. And of course, that's only possible because you do have these people who have proficiency and skills and the ingenuity to realize the visions of artists. So we're doing the first exhibition about this set of relationships between artists and their fabricators. And I kind of feel like it's almost like we're the first museum to do an exhibition about the Duchampian ready-made. I feel like it's that important as part of the story of art, but for various reasons, including discomfort around authorship, confidentiality agreements that exist between artists and their fabricators, no museum has ever done this before. So I'm really excited about that one. And that's it, really. I mean, that gives you a sense of what we're up to and how I'm trying to use the museum, both in a kind of lighter frame of mind, like mannequins, but also a much more serious, you might say heavyweight, frame of mind, like the Many Hands Artists and Fabricators show, but always trying to give people a sense, as I said, that they are understanding something about the way objects around them are made, and also that they themselves can take a hand in that literally. And that really is the mission of the museum, and it has been in the past. And hopefully what we're doing now is redefining that and relaunching it and making it even stronger going forward. So that's all I'm going to say, and any questions you may have, I'd be happy to try to answer. Thank you. Yeah. So, yeah, just in case people didn't read the review, what Roberta Smith said essentially was that we were, as the museum had often done in the past, so this was a kind of general observation about the institution, we were upholding the virtues of these expensive objects that are being made for an elite, rather than a kind of populist class of objects. So I kind of have a small, petty answer to that, and then a big, deeper answer to that. The small, petty to that is that it's quite accurate as a description of the museum historically. I wouldn't have actually said it's very accurate with respect to that show. I think that show, because it was crowdsourced and extremely varied, had a very broad class of objects in it, some of which were, public art of a kind. In fact, the stone carver I showed you, Chris Pelletieri, used to be the stone carver at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine. So you might describe that as a certain kind of elite patron, but obviously it's in a public or pseudo-public context. And we had, a feminist quilt collective from Brooklyn. We had a whiskey-making company. We had cigar rollers from the Dominican Republic. So it's a little bit hard for me to understand why she felt it was such a strong element of that show. So that's my petty answer. My deeper, more serious answer is that, of course, this has been the defining problem for craft since the days of the original British arts and crafts movement and William Morris, who famously raved about the problem of making his works for the swinish rich, which is not a phrase she used, but she could have, I suppose. And the basic problem, of course, is that if you want to make something by hand, it's going to be more expensive. And if you want to automate it, the problem in reverse is that you're going to end up with a situation that Mrs. Webb and others have seen as being mediocre and dehumanizing. And so my view of this, leaving aside the possibility that mass customization might be providing one form of solution to the problem, my view of this is that if you think about our mission from the production side, it's quite easy to see it as a humanist, progressive, individualist, life-affirming mission. If you think of it from the consumption side, it's very easy to see it as elitist, which is exactly the same as in William Morris's day, in Mrs. Webb's day. And there's not an easy solution to that problem. And I think if you're going to uphold the virtues and necessity of the preservation and advancement of skill in any period, you're going to run afoul of that problem.
And just carrying on to that, you talked about this dual, well, talked about the mission of the museum as a dual that great museum that's about environment and make. How do you hold that together with the idea of something that's kind of and technical sustainability?
Yeah. Well, that's, I think, a quite common human experience. I mean, that in a way, that's like a kid going to a baseball game and wanting to be a baseball player, isn't it? It's not like most of them are actually going to become Barry Bonds. But so it's a similar idea. We often talk about the ladder of skill. And, sometimes we are in the position of actually handing a child their very first raw material, which is quite a mind-blowing fact. But, there aren't art courses in a lot of schools in New York City. A lot of parents don't, encourage their kids to work with clay or, anything of that nature. So we're involved on that very, very primary level, and then we're involved at the level of utmost mastery, if I could use that word. And the key thing is to try to be active across that entire spectrum and continuum of skill and give people a sense that there's always more that they can learn, and there's a kind of aspirational, in a very good sense of the term, an aspirational course that they can pursue.
I think, a lot of museums themselves along those lines, right, to be more participatory, to have more kind of, it's almost like the education aspect of the museum is being pushed to the forefront in interesting ways. As sort of places like the Cooper Hewitt reopens in December, is going to attempt to do some of that. Will you kind of bolster and reinforce that aspect of the museum?
Yeah, that's absolutely what I've been saying, particularly with the Cooper Hewitt reopening and also, of course, MoMA doing its design program. I feel that particularly when it comes to designed artifacts, which after all include most things that we encounter in our daily lives, especially in the middle of New York City, I feel like it's very important that we lay claim to and hold fast to our mission as being about making and process rather than being another general design museum. So that's why I really, really want to emphasize production rather than issues of, consumption, public usage, symbolism and imagery, all of which are completely legitimate aspects of design and design criticism, but they're being dealt with better than we can elsewhere, yeah.
Yeah. Well, this exhibition you mentioned about the fabricators of the artwork sounds absolutely fascinating. Can you give us a little hint behind the scenes of the methods one might use for that, putting that together? Because that's really a new field. Like, how will you access those stories?
Yeah, it's tricky.
Right.
I mean, the first thing you learn is that there's a reason it hasn't happened.
Right.
Because people are very protective and a bit suspicious. And we have had quite a few artists either turn us down flat, like Damien Hirst, or not respond to our invitations, like Jeff Koons and Aj Kapoor. And you can read that a couple of ways because, of course, we're not a big heavyweight museum. We're not MoMA or even the Whitney. So it might be that us inviting Jeff Koons is a problem on the level of institutional weight and stature as well as topic. On the other hand, our guest curator, who's doing the show, used to run Jeff Koons' fabrication for him at Sonneban Gallery. So he's the person who's not having his emails answered. Yeah. And so that makes you think that there must be something problematic, and who knows what the real reason is. But beyond that non-responsiveness, I think it was very important for us to go through the door of the artist's intentions rather than go through the door of the fabrication companies. And I'm not sure that actually that would be the best way of doing it in an ideal world. I think it might be really interesting to do a show about Lippincott, Milgo Bufkin, Talix, all household names I'm sure you're familiar with. No? Those are the three largest fabrication companies in the New York area and have been since the 60s. So they made the work of Judd, Ellsworth Kelly, Klaus Oldenburg, well, anybody you can name. Well, there's a couple of problems with that. One is that it's a bit flat, actually, when you start thinking about it, because what you get is a bunch of big metal sculptures that happen to have been made in the same place by the same people, and if you can interview those people, that is interesting. But what's more interesting, probably, is to think about the way that an artist's intentions can be embodied by a skilled workforce, and the way that the workforce... So there's that, but also just practically speaking, if you want to get the loans, and you want to raise the money for it, you have to put the artist in the front. It has to be like, okay, Ai Weiwei is in this show, and he's making us a film about his jade and marble carvers in China. And then you're like, wow, really? Whereas if I say, we're profiling Milgo Bufkin, the largest metal fabrication shop in Brooklyn, it's a little bit like, okay, I'm not sure what that means, really. So it's partly name recognition, but it's also partly the fact that the artist really is realistically and legitimately in charge in a fabrication relationship. And so our curatorial process has kind of mapped that.
Thank you. Let's take some questions from students first, if possible.
Students first.
Christine definitely has a question.
Okay.
Yeah, I have so many questions. I'll just shoot with one. So first of all, wow, sounds like you're doing a lot of investigation, new display tactics. You're definitely breaking out of the mold and just putting things on the wall, so to speak, say it very casually. So this idea of makers and sending people to the sixth floor, see the process, and then go into the exhibition space. Is there any thought or foresight into making makers process a little bit more integral to the actual exhibition, and perhaps like pushing that change in the display format even further?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's one I've been asking myself on a daily basis. That would be the goal, for sure. And it's a little bit contingent on the project. So, for example, with the Ralph Pucci show, the mannequin show, in that case, we'll actually have the sculptor present, as I said. And then there will be this kind of suggestion of what the workshop is like. And then there will also be film of the real workshop. And it turns out, of course, that film is a very powerful medium for conveying this reality of making. But you have to be kind of careful of that, because the thing is, and I've learned this the hard way, if you put a $3,000 film next to a $3 million object, people will watch the film, right? Static objects cannot compete with film in people's visual experience. So you kind of have to keep the two things a bit separated, because otherwise you end up giving people an experience that's just one step up from YouTube, really. And there's certainly no shortage of watching things being made on YouTube. So you really have to think about the way the objects, these charismatic objects, still pay their way in the space and are given that kind of pride of place. But with that caveat, we are trying to use film and process footage. And then the other thing is actually having things happen in the galleries for real. So a good example of that would be that the Lewitt estate is actually allowing us to create a wall drawing over the course of the show. So the only time that you'll actually see the completed wall drawing is if you show up on the last day. And up until that time, what you'll see is somebody doing it and a stop motion kind of animation of it going together, so you have some understanding of what you're looking at. And we're looking for as many opportunities as we can to do that. But by far the easiest way is just to expand the existing Open Studio program. So we had these 3D scanners in the Out of Hand show, the digital fabrication show. We'll have Ralph Pucci's sculptor, as I said. Next year, we're also doing a show on fine watchmaking, which will probably infuriate Roberta Smith. But we're going to have a watchmaker in residence on the floor. So again, it's this whole idea of seeing the object and then meeting the person, or vice versa, so you have some understanding of what you're looking at.
How did you make the switch from scholar to curatorial arbitrator?
Ongoing,
It
right?
sounds like a good fit, but it seems like it might have been a stretch.
I mean, it's not that easy still. You know, I feel like my capacities tend to be in the areas of idea generation and you know, thinking about what a museum can do, whereas the kind of management and fundraising aspect of it is definitely a learning curve, and I try to be quite open and transparent about that. Like, if you think it's easy, try it. It's not easy. It's very, very political and demanding. But I did have a kind of running start, because when I was at the V&A, the last few years that I was there, I was the head of research, and that was a position that involved, well, I used to say it was like being intellectual quality control officer. So it wasn't like I was writing all the books that were coming out of the V&A. It's that I was helping to manage the process by which they were written and marshal scholarship and funding that would allow them to happen, and also the exhibition program. So, you know, I got to be the head of the department where the David Bowie show was curated, for example. But mostly what that involved was kind of wringing my hands and rewriting labels and saying, could you please make this a bit smarter? You know, because great thing about being head of research is like your work is never done. So, so I was already doing a kind of, you know, quarter material and funding role there, but obviously in a vastly different context. So, for example, the funding I was seeking was only coming from grant-giving bodies in the UK government, really, and it was all through applications, whereas now it's much more likely to happen over a cigarette on the sidewalk in Chelsea, which is what I was just doing before I came here, or you know, lunch at our museum restaurant, and you're just striking deals, that kind of thing. Really different, but not unenjoyable. You know, it's very interesting to try to get your fundraising strategy to align with your intellectual strategy. And that's something I'm still trying to make happen.
We haven't really we talked about the exhibitions, but we didn't really talk much about the collection.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and do you
Right, yeah.
I sort of forgot about that.
The collection,
Yeah. What are you going to do with that?
Okay, so a fair-minded and objective person, I think, would identify the collection as absolutely the glaring weak spot in my plan.
Okay.
Because everything that I'm saying suggests that all of my emphasis is on the process. And the thing about process is you can't really collect it. I mean, if you're an archive, you can sort of collect it, but we're not an archive. You know, we can have a Vimeo channel showing people making things, but that's hardly unusual or independent or unique to us. And so I have had some difficulty trying to work out what our priorities as a collecting institution should be. If you wanted to be really, really radical about it, which I don't, you could say maybe we shouldn't even have a collection. We're only little. You know, we got 12,000 square feet of space. We're in a city where there are several museums with hundreds of thousands of objects. We only have 3,000 objects in our collection.
And they're stored on site?
No, that's the other thing. Every object that we acquire imposes storage costs on us because it's almost all stored off-site, except for our jewelry collection. And I should say jewelry is a kind of exception to what I'm saying, because we do have the deepest, most comprehensive collection of contemporary jewelry in the country. And of course it's small, so it's easy to ship and acquire and store and keep care of. So that's a little bit of a special case. But apart from that, it's difficult to say, you know, if we're interested in mannequins and front loaders and buildings and dresses and shoes and hairstyles and, you know, sculptural nails, what do we collect? You know, everything? Nothing? Only things that are really, really well made? Well, if so, which ones and why? So that's a real dilemma to solve. Fortunately for me, we're about to hire a new chief curator, so I can kind of hand that problem to them. Think about it and formulate a set of objectives. But I think ultimately it's going to revolve around really three pillars, one of which is the jewelry collection, one of which is the existing historic collection, which is very strongly embedded in the studio craft movement that Eileen Webb started. And the other pillar will have to be some kind of contemporary acquisition, and maybe that will only be driven by our exhibition program. That might be one way of doing it, but that would certainly be enough for us to get on with. So that might be the answer.
Well, it does seem a really interesting area of discussion. You know, I mean, obviously MoMA has been part of that discussion in collecting the act symbol, for example, something intangible.
Yeah.
And I was thinking of that in relation to you guys with stuff like code. You know, that code as a kind of material and a process and a craft. Do you consider that as part of the remit? Do you draw some sort of...
Yeah. I prefer to think of us as a museum of the tangible and sensual. So it's partly because of what I was saying about on-screen experience. Like, I think there's so many institutions and organizations that are dedicated to the immaterial right now, or the digital. The digital is not really a material, as we know, but I kind of feel like actually something you can knock your knuckles on is quite important for us and is part of our identity. So I'm kind of keen to maintain that. I would say actually one of the questionable things about NYC Makers, I won't say weaknesses because some people really liked it, is that it had a lot of technology in it, like a new film process that sort of captured 3D data points called Depth Kit, which was a big hit, actually. People loved it. But I struggled to see how it related to the making agenda because it didn't have that.
The making agenda is tools.
Yeah, absolutely. That's true. Yeah, you can make an argument for it. I think just from a public point of view, though, I really feel like it's kind of because what I'm saying about inspiring people to make things, I feel like if you can walk into the gallery and get how something was made, not be able to just go and do it yourselves, because obviously it's going to be difficult, but to say, okay, chisel, wood, got it. That's really important. And I feel like these more system-wide, dispersed, technical and digital means of making, I just feel like that's not going to be where our home is. But I might be wrong about that.
Any other questions from Molly first? Yeah.
You spoke earlier about sort of gender in this world.
Yeah.
I was wondering kind of how the museum maybe positioning itself in relation to gender.
Yeah. So the short, how are we positioning ourselves with respect to gender? The short answer is that we're positioning ourselves as a feminist institution. So that's partly because of the story of our founder, and it's also because the legacy of histories of making are very strongly impacted by histories of gender inequity and, of course, ethnic and racial inequity also. But I think in particular, we have both an opportunity and an obligation to tell the story of women and the history of women as makers. So we are actually doing a show, I'm glad you asked this, we're doing a show next spring called Pathmakers, which is about women who used the craft and design disciplines as professional pathways in the 1950s and 60s. So here I'm thinking about people like Eva Zeisel, Dorothy Liebes, Maya Grotel, the potter, Edith Heath, West Coast ceramic manufacturer, Toshiko Takezu, some of whom are well known today, some of whom aren't. And we're sort of telling their stories. And if you think about it, you'll realize that in painting, sculpture, and architecture, it was very, very difficult for women to get any position at all in the 1950s. Think of Lee Krasner, and what she was putting up with, in her relationship to Jackson Pollock and his supporters, whereas the most prominent and powerful people in the textile field, the ceramic field, were women. And so we're telling those stories and then including a group of contemporary makers who are kind of looking back at that moment. So that's one example. But it's very striking that about 40 to 45% of our collection is by women, and that's less than half, but it's a hell of a lot more than most institutions. And I really want to, and it's partly because I'm aware that I took over from a woman director as well. She was there for 16 years, so I think there's a really strong impetus to do important and progressive work on gender at the museum, and I definitely want to keep doing that. Yeah.
I just want to say that I'm a big fan of Invention.
Yeah, there we go, yeah.
And I just wanted to ask about digital fabrication and the relationship between the hand and the craft maker.
Mm-hmm.
And what you feel, what I feel like almost like industry sponsorship, such as for example, Shapeways that they have.
Yeah.
Done many their participation in the scanning 3D and then all of the theaters. And I use Shapeways, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
So I am using Shapeways for digital application jewelry. So I strongly encourage you to keep that up. They still collect jewelry.
Mm.
But do you feel like you're going to expand in the direction of doing like public-private partnerships?
Mm-hmm.
Manufacturers?
Yeah.
Commercial manufacturers?
Yeah. Yeah.
The same way. How do you define what is craft and what is design object that's commercially produced?
Yeah. Well, I think there's kind of two questions there. One is where do you draw the line between craft making and digital production, which is kind of getting back to what you were asking about, Alice. I mean, I kind of feel like insofar as we're interested in shaping the physical through tools, it doesn't really make sense to say, but only some tools. So I think digitally powered tools are absolutely within the frame of interest for us. So Shapeways, for example, would be examples of that. No, not necessarily. I mean, that's why we're doing the fun watchmaking show. So there you're talking about, Swiss companies that might be 250 years old that are making watches, and they're making a couple of thousand watches a year, maybe. So it's not an artisanal. It's artisanal. Right. It's luxury sector. Well, yeah. So that's the second part of the question. I mean, I feel, in all candidness, that we would have a lot of catching up to do to approximate the ethical problems that fine art museums have with this. So I would suggest to you that working with a watch brand like Vacheron Constantin and celebrating the artisans that work behind the scenes is a hell of a lot more ethically on the up and up than suggesting that Jeff Koons is the sole individual of interest in the production of his work.
Oh, I'm all for celebrating.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, it's a massive issue. It's a massive issue, but I feel like, insisting on a kind of clear separation between what we're doing and commercial interest or entrepreneurial activity is neither possible nor desirable. It's sort of like what I was saying about the Mad Store. I feel like for us, the thing to do is to identify entrepreneurs and makers and companies that we actually think are doing a good job and providing good work for people, helping train people, maintain skill sets, expand skill sets, and then basically say to the public, damn right, we think this watchmaking company is amazing, and we're going to tell you all about them, because they are amazing. Yeah, exactly. Or whether it's an art form or not. I mean, I'm not so concerned with what counts as art, craft, and design. I think that's not interesting to me. It used to be. But I'm much more interested in the kind of action, the processes. So it's not so much the classification of the activity, it's the fact that the activity is of interest because of its skill and sort of human factor, I guess. So what I want to do is simply become a museum that's upholding standards of excellence and recognizing standards of excellence in making. And if that allows us to work productively with a commercial or private interest, then we'll do that.
It's interesting because next week our speaker is the Director of Design Programs at the NEA. So we can
Jason.
the lack of government funding to this kind of institution. Been carried on. So I think we should probably wrap up now because I know Dan's got another event. So I want to invite you all to stay and have a drink and a snack in the next room. But before we take our craft movement next door, please join me in thanking once again Ben Adamson. I think we're okay.
Yeah.
I forgot to bring my phone.
Yeah. I did need to run.